Last week we saw the Sun, Mercury and Venus come into conjunction with Pluto in Aquarius. This week we see the conjunction of Mars. And this is very much about power. It can bring intense willpower and courage, but it can also bring brute force and ruthlessness. So I've been contemplating power and looking at it from all angles. I can see that most of us are taught that power means control. And it's a myth because it promises certainty in a world that is fundamentally uncertain. Power is the capacity to affect outcomes, to shape reality. With it, we can set the terms, we can protect boundaries and influence what happens next. But there are two arenas of power. There's our human power, our autonomy, our family roles, what we learn as our cultural scripts, political systems and faith communities. But there's also beyond human power, nature's cycles that bring volcanoes, tornadoes, tsunamis, and also the cycles of birth, death and rebirth. We have the moon's pull on the tides and the sun's life force. And we have the wider cosmos and the asteroids and comets that pass through. It is an uncertainty. The power can mature into stewardship. We can protect, we can have responsibility and accountability, or it can distort into domination, control, coercion, fear that is presented and expressed as authority. When life feels uncontrollable, we often compensate by tightening control over ourselves, others, and over the narrative. And this is exacerbated when it's institutional or governmental control. And that's where conflict comes, where we can burn out, where we can learn a spiritual rigidity and a winning at any cost. Those dynamics begin to creep in. I'm not here to demonize power or to romanticize surrender. I'm here to explore integrated power, acting where you can, releasing what you can't, and living in right relationship with bigger forces. To surrender, being in denial of the uncertainty that life brings, and surrendering to the larger, uncontrollable power that surrounds us in nature, in the cosmos and beyond. The myth of power says that control is safety, it keeps us safe, but the deeper truth is that power is a relationship, it's a dynamic relationship. Real power isn't certainty, it's the courage to meet reality without needing to dominate it. And stewardship is what power becomes when it stops trying to be God. Hello, welcome back to Soul Symbols Astrology. My name's Karen Sullivan and I hope that you enjoy this podcast today. If you do, please give it a like and a subscribe and drop your reflections of how you see power operating in your life and the community around you. Power is one of those words that can make people feel very tense. We've all seen power abused, but we've also all needed it. When you look at power as an archetype, it stops being only out there in politics, institution, and it becomes something closer, something that is honest, a force that lives in relationships, in systems, and in the inner life, in our psyches. Archetype. At its simplest, power is the capacity to affect outcomes, the ability to set terms and shape the reality around us. Power can always be the protection of boundaries, the ability to make decisions and influence what is happening next. The archetypal question isn't about, do you have power? It's how are you using it and what is it doing to you? So most conversations about power stay in the human realm. So authority, control, influence. But power also exists beyond us. It's showing up in rhythm and as nature. It shows up in the sky. And this matters because we forget that some power is uncontrollable. So we tend to compensate by trying to control everything we can. A helpful way to keep our thinking clear is to notice that power comes in different forms, and not all of them are about domination. There are 4 modes of power. Power over is the first one, and it's the ability to enforce, command, or to stop harm. In its healthy form, it protects. Like a parent will pull a child away from danger, enforcing that boundary, forcefully, really. A community draws a firm line around abuse. But in its shadow, it can become control for control's sense. And that can be enforced via intimidation, punishment, and coercion. The second form of power is the power to, and that is capacity. So we're speaking about skill here, competence, the ability to act. It's what turns intentions into movement and action. And in its healthy form, it will create options and freedom. But with the shadow, it's the ego, which is saying, I can, so I should. I've got the power to, so I will. Or I'm only worthy when I'm capable. The third type of power is power with, and that is our collective strength. It's about how we cooperate. It's about building coalitions and shared strategies. So in its healthy form, this is solidarity and mutual protection. And I believe it was Edward Said, the Palestinian activist, who said solidarity is the greatest form of love. But in its shadow, it can become that group think, social policing, the mob dynamic that crushes any sense of nuance. We saw this with COVID, the social policing, in terms of enforcing institutional policy. And it's an either or. We see it in the political landscape, black and white, red and blue. You're on that side or that side. It's the crushing of that nuance. And then we have power within. And this is our inner authority, our sense of sovereignty. And this is about our integrity and the ability to stay connected to our values even under pressure. So this, in its healthy form, expresses as a calm clarity. But with shadow, it can harden into spiritual pride, a rigidity, or I'm above this detachment. A lot of pain comes from overusing one of those 4 modes or underdeveloping another. If we trust power within, we may avoid necessary conflict. And if we only trust power over, we might confuse control with safety. And if you only trust power with, you might outsource your judgment to the group or institution. But there is another kind of power that we often forget to name or we ignore because of the implications of it. And it's power beyond the human, the moon, the sun, and the force of rhythm. So some power doesn't belong to anyone. It's not negotiable and it doesn't care how good we are, how spiritual or how prepared we feel. It simply moves. The moon is pulling the tides. The sun is giving us life, but it can also flare. So we have these cycles of day becoming night. We box into our 24-hour period. Winter becomes a spring. And even within our bodies, we sleep and we wake. Even if we never look up, we are living within these forces. So this power is rhythm. It's not domination or moral superiority or even intention. It's that kind of power that shapes life by being consistent, vast, and inescapably relational. We can't ignore it. So the moon's power works through a pull. It draws us back to what we can't outrun. Our emotional weather, our needs, what our limits are, our cravings, and our fatigue, and even our longing for belonging. So the moon here is a reminder that we are cyclic, we are tidal, and we carry memory in the body. So we can decide we're fine and still feel that undertow of grief, desire, or fear tugging at our choices. Solar power is easier to recognize because it's visible. The sun is that daily rhythm of light and dark. It rises and it sets. It gives warmth and growth, brings energy and direction, and causes photosynthesis. But it also is demanding something from us. We can't live in permanent darkness and call it health. The sun is not just a gentle life force that is consistent. It exposes and it intensifies, but it can also overheat systems. It's the same energy that sustains life and can also disrupt it. So when you put the moon and sun together, you get a deeper definition of power than who wins. Power is also what sets the tempo. So the moon governs return and integration, whilst the sun governs direction and expression. A lot of suffering comes from trying to live solar only in a lunar body. The moon represents our body. Solar living looks like a constant output, the always on productivity, our endless goals and perpetual growth. It can be never enough rest or never enough softness. It can work for a while, but when that lunar truth arrives, the body collapses. Our emotional backlog surges. Our relationships can be under strain. And meaning thins out for us here. Lunar living, on the other hand, looks like endless processing. Taking up permanent residence in our inner world, and those looping feelings and waiting for that sense of certainty before we act. So that can feel safe to us. But when the solar truth arrives, life requires participation. We need to make choices, and there are limits to those choices, and it requires action from us. This matters for the archetype of power because it shows the difference between control and relationship. Some power can be negotiated with it, and some power can only be honoured. And if we don't honour rhythm, we tend to try and dominate ourselves and others to compensate. So we are looking at two kingdoms of power as such. So that human power, choice, agency, politics, family systems, influences. But we are also looking at the non-human power of the cosmos, but we also have nature, time, uncertainty, the divine. So human power is asking or requiring from us accountability, responsibility. Non-human power is asking us for humility. So when we look at that non-human power, we're looking at fear and the sublime. It's power that dwarfs us, and it creates two common responses, reverence or terror, or can be the stabilizer. It puts ego back in proportion, while that fear can become control mania or a spiritual bypassing. When power is uncontrollable, the question shifts from how do I win and becomes, how do I prepare? How do I adapt? How do I grieve or build, rebuild? How do I stay in right relationship? It brings a kind of initiation that only the uncontrollable can give us. It's surrender, acceptance, resilience, faith, meaning making, reverence for life. And we have that integration in a mature way. A person holding power who has that integration, that mature power, holds both. They act where they can and they bow to what they must, and don't confuse either of those things with weakness. And then we have that elemental power. Nature teaches us power as a cycle, a threshold, and consequence. We have birth, death, rebirth, growth, decay, renewal, creation, and destruction is a single process. It looks polarized, it looks dual, but it's one process. So nature as power is not morality. The storms, the hurricanes, the earthquakes and volcanoes are often couched in terms as punishments from God. And it can be brought down to a personal level. Winter comes because it's cyclical, because it is a law of nature. And nature is that power without intention. And that is part of its terror and its purity, because we cannot control it. So the seasonal cycles come. We have the planting, the ripening, the harvest, the fallow time. And with our body cycles, we have breath, hunger, sleep, aging. There's an ecological cycle, decay as compost, and death as a redistribution. Cycles are the original fate. They come whether we consent or not. Death comes. Ripening of our food or the failure of a crop comes. We can't control that. And disasters, natural disasters, become that revealing force. They can expose what was already true, the weaknesses of our infrastructure, the inequality. Community strength can show up when there's natural disaster. It's a response to it. We see the competence of leaderships, of government, and our social trust. So where there is the uncontrollable, it reveals what we can control, what we can work with. But there's also those threshold moments, flood, fire, storm, and they are archetypal initiations. They're stripping illusion, they're dissolving, they reorder priorities, and they demand real-time ethics. So that sense of mutual aid, triage, leadership, courage and grief. These things require responses from us and a complete grounding for us. We see what our communities, our governments, and our own inner life, we see where we are at with all those things under the uncontrollable. But we can have that preparedness, living with that elemental power and the unknowing of it. It's preparedness as devotion. Having a practical reverence for these things, grief as by ways of intelligence, because it's teaching us what matters, and community as resilience. And we see this over and over again in disaster zones. So it's power with, it's the face of the greater, the thing that's bigger than me. And I've talked already about the lunar and solar power, about the rhythm and the power. But we can also look at the planetary power, as the gods in motion. The planets are not just influences, they are archetypal intelligence. So that power becomes a pantheon, it's multiple forces, each with a domain, a temple, a domicile, each capable of blessing or disturbance. So it is like a myth in motion. So these planets mirror our psyches. They are archetypes. Each planet has an archetypal landscape, and they live within us. This is the as above, so below. They mirror and they time what's unfolding. So it's that symbolic. Astrology is the symbolic weather. It's not control. It's that orientation. It's that conscious awareness of working with, the same as we have to work with nature and the weather, the things bigger than us. So each planet is that God force in the sense of it has gifts, shadows, and initiations. So Mars, who's with Pluto at the moment, is that force. It's force, it's severing, courage and conflict. We have Venus as cohesion, attraction, harmony, value. We have Saturn as limit, time, consequence, structure, and Jupiter as meaning, law, faith, and expansion. And Mercury, the mind, it's exchange, it's a trickster intelligence. Then, as we've already talked about, the moon is that sense of belonging. It's relational, it's about body, mood, memory, our everyday. And the sun is sovereignty, vitality, and purpose. And then we have the outer planets. As I said, Mars sitting with Pluto. The outer planets are generational. They are slow-moving collective planets that bring archetypes for a whole generation. So then we look at fate, choice, and that dance. So the fate is the conditions. It's the given in one sense. The given as in the weather, the cycles, the death, the everyday. So it's the given, it's those conditions. And the seasons and the transits are the timing, our timing. And then we have the choice in character, our response to that. So it's happening. It is how we relate and interact with that. And then the charts, the horoscope is the meaning maker. Whenever we cast a chart, whether it's electional, whatever it is, it's the meaning maker. So it's that icon. It's a pattern. So it isn't certainty. It's relationship with uncertainty, the same as we have with nature. And then we have integration, having reverence without outsourcing our agency. So it's that listen to the gods, but don't surrender your ethics to them. And don't be possessed by them. Okay, that it's relating to them, the same as you don't give your autonomy away to another person. You don't give your autonomy away to the planets or live as they have power, complete power over you. You still have free will, you still have choice. And sometimes the choice, as with a natural disaster, is it only in how you respond to those happenings. But astrology is that counsel for us. It's that sign in some spiritual literature. The stars were set into the sky as signs. And then we have the danger in the sky. And this can look like an initiation of uncertainty. The cosmos is not safe for us any more than the weather is and our natural planet is. We've got comets, asteroids, solar storms. So there's that ever-present potential for disruption. And this is power as contingency. Life is not guaranteed. So we humans like to build certainty as a coping strategy. It is an illusion of control. The sky is quietly teaching us here that existence is contingent. And there's that psychological impact of cosmic risk. There's awe, dread, existential humility. And how our mind responds to that, we can respond to this existential reality by complete denial or by obsessing over it. We can have superstition, or we can do that very creative meaning making with it. But we can come up with two complete distortions, that theta fatalism, nothing matters. I've got no control, so nothing matters. Or we can have that control addiction. If I manage enough, I'll be safe. And we see this happening in our governments, don't we? They're either trying to, they're trying now to do weather programs, control the weather. Hubris, complete hubris. It's something much bigger than us. But there is also, from these two distortion, there's that third path. The middle way is existential courage. It's a living with reverence. It's living with that kind of humility. It's a building of resilience and love in any way. It's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. It's that kind of attitude to life. And it is that stewardship as a mature power. And then, of course, we have the biggest unknown of all is looking at the divine, however you clarify that, however you bring structure or meaning to that. God, goddess, a religion, but the divine as ineffable power. So it's the deepest power is one we can't name. So for many of us, the divine is both the meaning of life and the reminder that life can never be fully explained. So the two faces of the divine in human experience, it's that mystery that consoles, that sense of belonging, of purpose, of love. But it's also mystery that can terrify us. So it can be uncertainty, the unknowing, the loss of control. Whenever there is something bigger than us, we can feel it if we're not a powerful global leader. That sense of no control over what happens. And this is extended with the divine because it is to that degree unknowable. But we can bring certainty in to this arena, the spiritual arena that functions as control. And faith can be intimate with unknowing. So it's a crucial distinction. We find, many people find, the more knowledge we gain, the more understanding, the more lived experience, the expansion of what you don't know. Knowledge can be a curse. We realize that what we know and what we experience is, a drop in the ocean, a grain of sand, however, it's so minuscule to the overall all. We don't even know what we can see, smell, touch, feel, hear, through our five senses, let alone the unknowable, the mystery of life, those things that can't be seen. And then we have what can't be spoken, because leading on from that knowledge, that knowing, I was saying that, the divine is unsayable. It's beyond concepts, beyond explanation. You listen to the mystics and they are without words. When people have had altered states of consciousness, be it through plant medicine or through spiritual encounter of one sort or another, words fail. It is beyond language. Even our own unconscious, our dream lives can be the unsaid. It can come in symbols, it can come in feelings. It's beyond language, it's beyond knowing. But we do have shadow here again. We have spiritualized control. So when people are using the divine or God or truth to dominate, shame, threaten, exile or justify harm, that can be the power archetype of the priest or the ideologue. We've also got to acknowledge the shadow of spiritual bypassing or escapism, So the integration of this is devotion as a relationship. It's not a possession. So the mature spirituality doesn't need to be right to be real. It's tending life. It's telling the truth. It's repairing. being a repairer of the wall. And so we have the power of the divine, the ineffable, the unknowable, the unsayable. We have the cosmos, the archetypal landscape. And we have our natural world and the weather and the natural disasters, along with all the beauty and the cycles, the birth, death, rebirth cycles. And then we've gone from above there, above, and we're now at the below. So how do we look at power in terms of our everyday? It's really useful to name what power is made of in our everyday. It can be position. That power comes with position, with our roles and titles in the hierarchy of how organizations and societies are set up. We can have the manager, the parent, the teacher, the elder. And then our resources. There is power dynamics within money, within time, and access or lack of it, housing and lack of it, the same with money, time, transport, childcare, all those issues around resources. Then we have the issue of force, power as force, threat, punishment, exclusion and exile or retaliation. And power as knowledge in the form of information, expertise, and secrecy. Who is allowed to know what? Who knows what? Who has the power to that information and knowledge? And then there's social capital. There's power in our networks, whether they're at work, socially, or online. And our reputation and popularity, our sense of belonging. That reputation, you often see if the powers that be feel that somebody needs to be unseated, they often go straight for the reputation to dethrone someone and their power. And then we have this charisma, the cult of personality can be power, the power of persuasion. And of course, that can come in the social narrative and the narrative, the political narrative, the narrative that we have farmed out through media and can be propaganda. And that charisma as magnetism, how we're drawn and present. And then there's the moral or spiritual authority that we see, and that comes in the forms of values, virtue, the truth, in quotations, and divine sanction. So if you want to understand a power dynamic quickly, look at who controls the access and who can withdraw something essential, whether it's love, money, belonging, safety, approval. And who is it that gets believed by default? And who is allowed to be angry and who gets punished for it? These are very quick ways to understand where the power lies in those dynamics. So I'm going to have a look at power across autonomy, our sense of sovereignty, family, culture, politics and faith. So autonomy, this is not just about our independence. It's about the ability to make real choices without being emotionally, financially, or morally cornered. So we can see our autonomy being taken away at one relational level within a partnership, domestic partnership, where emotional and financial means can be used for coercion. But the power dynamics can also show up as internalized rules. So rules like good people don't say no, we may have grown up with, or anger is dangerous, or even talking about how, or feeling that our own needs are a form of selfishness. But it can also come as those external pressures. If dependency. When we're children, we're very dependent upon our parents. Our autonomy is limited. It can come as the external pressure that brings fear of conflict and threats of abandonment. But healthy power supports autonomy, and that is by making consent real, not theoretical. So you're actually actively making that consent real. So how does this work out? Family, the power dynamics in family, and they transmit power. If we look at family as an archetype, power is transmitted through roles, through loyalty contracts, and definitely through unspoken rules, which is why that can sometimes affect our autonomy later in life. It's programmed in those unspoken rules. Sometimes love does become currency. Affection is given when you comply, and it's withdrawn when you don't. Or that caring can become leverage in the sense of, and we've probably all said it, and we've all heard it, after all I've done for you, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes the family story, the family narrative is a form of governance. So those rules of, in this family, we don't shout, or we don't get angry, or we don't explicitly show emotion. When you look closely, a lot of family power, it's not about abuse or cruelty. It's about anxiety. It's about the people with the power within the family reaching for control when they themselves don't know how to feel safe. And that can come from their upbringing and their depreciated sense of autonomy. And then power within culture. You know, cultures teach what is normal, what's respectful, what behavior is shameful and what behavior is allowed. So the cultural power is the power of that unspoken script. It often operates through status and language and the tone of our language, how we dress, who gets labelled as difficult, you know, who's breaking the social norms, that usually is. And you can feel cultural power when you notice you're editing yourself before you've even spoken. That's a way to know that power dynamic, cultural power dynamic is in operation. And then, of course, in politics, that political power, that if we look at political power, it's a distribution of decision making at scale. So we can scale it up from the family to the political. So this includes our institutions, the laws that we have, plus the enforcement of those laws, and the narratives. What counts as legitimate, whose needs are prioritized, and what is made invisible. And with narratives, again, they often employ the media. So I think Noam Chomsky, what was his book name? Manufacturing Consent. And that's about, you know, getting the consent to go to war or take any political action, but manufacturing the consent of the people. We can look at the Iraq weapons of mass destruction. A good example of that among hundreds, unfortunately. But political power is not just about the elections, and some would argue there's not a lot of power there with elections because the choices are so limited. It's also showing up in whether people have access to housing, healthcare, safety, education, and more often a voice, an opinion, a voice, a political voice. And we find in the West, they are often pointing out countries who they say suppress the voices of the people. And yet they have massive healthcare crises, massive housing crisis, homelessness, difficulties in the education system. And increasingly, and unfortunately, a censorship on what can be spoken in the West. And then we move on to faith and belief here. And faith, it can be that genuine source of meaning and healing I spoke about, the divine, a short while ago. But it can also become a place where power is hiding, and it's hiding behind that sense of righteousness. So truth gets used as a weapon, and harm gets justified. So, yeah, we can look at that. We can go right back and look at the Catholic Crusades, Christian Crusades. It's righteousness and the truth of the gospel, and when the saints go marching on, and we go and obliterate and burn at the stake and that sort of thing. Harm is justified. And it's when belonging is conditional on obedience. So conscience is being outsourced there. Healthy spiritual power tends to enlarge a person's capacity for responsibility, autonomy, and humility and compassion. But when that power is unhealthy spiritual power, it tends to shrink people into fear, shame, and control. So the shadow of power, how is it distorting? So it's often that emperor energy, the king energy with fear underneath it. So if we look at power, the archetype of the tyrant is wanting to control everything, but underneath there's often a terror of uncertainty, of betrayal or weakness. And we can see it in global leaders now, but I always think of Henry VIII. He was in constant fear of betrayal, so he controlled it by beheading or imprisoning nearly everyone. That's that sense of fear under that kingship. But then we've got the manipulator, and a lot of us fall into this category and don't like to admit it, but the manipulator will say, I can't ask directly. There's a sense of not having that assertion, so I'll pull strings. Okay, so it's manipulating covertly. And so underneath that is often that fear of rejection or conflict. And then we got the ideologue, who is what would there be? Their mantra would be, I'm right, so I'm justified. But underneath that can be a fear of moral complexity. And the technocrat is saying it's just policy. And underneath that can be that fear of personal accountability. And then the archetype of the seducer often comes up in personal relationships, but can come out elsewhere, is I'll blind you with attention, desire, approval. And underneath is the fear of being ordinary or alone. But then there's also this shadow that we don't often talk about, because it's the opposite of power. But there is a power in powerlessness. So we can see this in martyrdom. That can be the person in the family who cooks, cleans, is the domestic, the nurse, the doctor, the counsellor, the worker, the whatever. And they are doing it with a sense of martyrdom. I have to do this. This is my role. That is often the person who comes out with the say, as I said before, after all I do for you, okay? But there can also be the powerlessness of appeasement, a learned helplessness, and that chronic, I don't have a choice. And they can all be genuine responses to real constraint, Parents can often take up that martyrdom archetype because they're constrained with the needs of home and family, children. But it can also become a strategy to a way of avoiding risk, conflict or responsibility. So that staying powerless can sometimes protect a person from being blamed or rejected, or from outgrowing their role in a system. So useful to ask ourselves is, what do I gain by staying where I am, if we recognize that archetype? Then power can become almost like, I always like to talk about initiation. It can become an initiation of mature power. So in archetypal terms, power matures when it becomes stewardship. So what's this look like? It is power that can be questioned. So someone who has mature power will always be open to question and criticism. And it doesn't, they don't need to punish anyone who disagrees with them. It doesn't punish dissent. Mature power also sets boundaries without humiliating and saying no kindly, okay, without kind of cruelty there. And it has the ability, mature power, to repair after harm. Instead of defending an image, be that an individual, a political system, a family, or an institution. Okay. And it will understand proportional response, that not everything requires escalation. And we see this so much politically. In our most recent times, we have seen the most disproportional response to something that happened, and constant escalation. Okay. And that is definitely not mature power. So you can recognize integrated powers in that they are clear, their boundaries are clear, their process, their trajectory is clear. It's accountable and not performative. It's not about the image. So it's a sense of that power doesn't need you to shrink so it feels more powerful or bigger than you. Okay. And if you're looking at that in your life, you can look at where you confuse control with safety. You can look at the power dynamics that you exert or that are coming towards you. So where do I confuse control with safety, or use care as leverage, even if that's very subtly? And where do I outsource my authority to a person, a group, or a belief system? Where am I afraid? What am I afraid would happen if I set a clean boundary? And what's the currency in this dynamic? Is it approval, money, love, belonging, access, morality? And then you can ask yourself that if you acted as a steward here, what would change? How would it change the whole dynamic? And where do I need more power or capacity? Where do I need more power to that types of power, that capacity, instead of more power over control, that control power? And what would repair look? And what either stops me or the other from offering it? So to close, there's a lot here. Power is not the opposite of love. In its mature form, power protects love, life, and dignity. So the work is learning the difference between power used to create safety and power used to avoid feeling. So when power becomes stewardship, it stops being a fight for the throne and becomes a practice of integrity. So if you're still here, thank you for listening. My reflection on power, given Pluto's transit, all the planets' transits through Pluto. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.